Good evening, folks. Where are you two coming from tonight?
We were just...
Don't. Let me handle it. We're headed home. That's all you need to know.
Sir, I need to ask her a couple of questions as well. Ma'am, are you all right?
I'm fine.
She's fine. I told you. We're good. Let's wrap
I still
this
need
up.
to hear from her. Can you let her answer?
No, you can hear from me. We're leaving.
The traffic stop. March 14th, 2025. A routine traffic checkpoint on a rural Nebraska highway. Officer Michael Torres was working the afternoon shift when a pickup truck approached around 3:45. Something about the vehicle caught his attention. He signaled for it to pull over. Inside the truck were two people. The driver was an older man, early 60s, weathered face like someone who'd spent his life working outdoors. His hands gripped the steering wheel tight, knuckles white. The passenger was young, maybe 18 or 19 years old. Long dark hair, pale skin, eyes that looked somewhere past Torres, unfocused, vacant. Something about her made Torres pause before he even reached the window. He approached the driver's side, hand resting casually near his weapon out of habit. Tapped on the glass. The window rolled down slowly. The older man stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Torres could feel tension radiating from the truck, like heat from pavement in summer. "Evening, folks. Where are you two coming from tonight?" The man's response came quick, defensive. "We were just headed home. That's all you need to know." Torres leaned slightly to get a better look at the passenger. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, staring at the dashboard. Something was wrong. 12 years on the job had taught Torres to trust his gut, and his gut was screaming right now. "Sir, I need to ask her a couple questions as well." Torres kept his voice calm, professional. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "She's fine." The driver cut in before she could respond. "I told you we're good. Let's go." "I still need to hear from her," Torres said firmly. "Can you let her answer?" The young woman's lips moved. "I'm fine." The words came out flat, mechanical, like someone reading a script they'd been given. Her voice had no life in it. Her eyes never moved from the dashboard. Torres had seen fear before. He'd seen people in shock, people on drugs, people in mental health crises. This was different. This was someone who'd been broken, someone who'd learned that the only safe answer was whatever answer kept the situation calm. "Ma'am, I need you to look at me." Torres waited. The woman's eyes slowly moved toward him. For just a second, Torres saw something flash across her face. Not fear exactly, something deeper. Resignation, hopelessness. A silent scream trapped behind a mask of compliance. The driver's body language shifted. His hand moved slightly toward the center console. Torres's training kicked in. His own hand moved to his weapon. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." That's when everything went wrong. The Bodycam footage shows the next few seconds in grainy, chaotic detail. The driver's hand moving fast. Metal flashing. Torres shouting. Movement. A gunshot. The camera angle jerks violently as Torres is hit. Another shot. The camera tilts toward the sky, catching nothing but clouds and the sound of a third gunshot. Then silence. Just the sound of Torres gasping, trying to breathe through the pain, trying to reach his radio. When backup units arrived 11 minutes later, they found Officer Torres on the ground beside the truck, bleeding from 2 gunshot wounds. One bullet had caught him in the shoulder. Another had grazed his ribs. He was conscious, barely, trying to tell them what happened. Inside the truck, 2 bodies. The driver slumped against his door, a gun in his lap, a bullet wound under his chin. The passenger was in her seat, head tilted back, a single gunshot wound to her temple. She'd been killed first. The driver was identified through his license and vehicle registration. Harold Rigsby, 61 years old, a farmer who'd lived in the area his entire life. Owned property about 15 miles from the checkpoint, a decent-sized spread that had been in his family for generations. Known locally, but kept to himself mostly. Quiet guy. Went to church sometimes. Bought his supplies at the farm store in town. Nobody would have called him friendly exactly, but he wasn't someone who raised red flags either. Just another old farmer trying to keep his land going. The passenger took longer to identify. She had no identification on her. No wallet, no phone, no personal belongings, but her face was familiar to the investigators who arrived at the scene. They'd seen it before. On flyers, on missing person bulletins, on social media posts that had been shared thousands of times. Emma Caldwell, 18 years old, and she'd been missing for 5 months. Emma had disappeared the previous October on a clear autumn afternoon. She'd been staying with her grandparents on their farm about 30 miles from where the shooting happened, helping out like she did every summer and fall since she was a little kid. Her parents lived in the city. Her father, Thomas, worked in insurance. Her mother, Rebecca, was a nurse. But Emma loved the farm life, loved the animals, the open spaces, the simplicity of rural work. She'd spent that October helping her grandfather with the harvest, feeding livestock, doing the million small tasks that keep a farm running. On October 12th, around 2 in the afternoon, Emma had walked out to check on some cattle in the far pasture. The property was big, over 100 acres, with fields and woods and fence lines that needed constant maintenance. Emma taking a walk to check on animals was completely normal. Nobody thought twice about it. When she hadn't come back by 4, her grandmother started to worry. By 5, her grandfather went out looking, driving his truck along the dirt roads that crisscrossed the property, calling her name. By 6, when darkness was falling and there was still no sign of her, they called the police. The search started immediately. Local law enforcement brought in tracking dogs that night. Volunteers from neighboring farms joined the effort at first light. They searched every inch of the property, the woods, the fields, the outbuildings, the creek that ran along the southern boundary. Nothing. No sign of Emma. No torn clothing. No dropped phone. No indication of where she'd gone or what had happened to her. The search expanded. State police brought in helicopters with thermal imaging. The FBI got involved because of the possibility of abduction. Hundreds of volunteers combed the surrounding area for days. Emma's face appeared on every telephone pole, every store window, every social media feed for 100 miles. Her parents drove out from the city and stayed with her grandparents, waiting for news that never came. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The active search eventually scaled back as leads dried up. The case went cold. Emma's family held on to hope, but prepared themselves for the worst. Her mother, Rebecca, appeared on local news broadcasts, pleading for information. Her father, Thomas, organized additional search parties on weekends. Her friends from high school created social media pages dedicated to finding her. But as winter settled over Nebraska and the months stretched on, the community began to accept that Emma Caldwell was probably dead, her body hidden somewhere they'd never find it. Except Emma hadn't been dead. Not until that afternoon in March, when Harold Rigsby shot her in his truck at a police checkpoint. For 5 months, Emma Caldwell had been alive, and she'd been 3 miles from her grandparents' farm the entire time. 3 miles. Close enough that if she'd screamed loud enough on a quiet day, someone might have heard her. Close enough that her family had probably driven past the property where she was being held dozens of times during those months of searching. Harold Rigsby's farm sat at the end of a long dirt road that curved through empty fields. The farmhouse was old, probably built in the 1950s, white paint peeling, shutters hanging crooked. A barn stood nearby, red paint faded to pink. Various equipment sat rusting in the yard. The nearest neighbor was more than a mile away. You could do anything on that property, and nobody would see or hear. When investigators arrived with a search warrant 2 hours after the shooting, they found where Emma had been kept. The entrance was in the kitchen, a door that looked like it led to a regular basement. Wooden stairs descended into darkness. At the bottom, another door. This one was different, heavy, reinforced from the outside with metal brackets. A padlock hung open on the latch. Beyond that door was a room. Concrete walls, concrete floor, no windows. A single bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, controlled by a switch outside the door. In one corner, a stained mattress lay directly on the concrete. In another corner, a plastic bucket. In the center of the room, bolted into the concrete floor, was an iron ring. A chain was attached to it, heavy steel links about 8 feet long enough to reach the mattress, long enough to reach the bucket, not long enough to reach the stairs. The chain ended in a heavy-duty padlock that had been opened. Next to the mattress, investigators found evidence of prolonged habitation, a thin blanket, a few items of clothing, a plastic plate, and cup. Everything was filthy. The smell in that room was indescribable. Sweat and fear and human waste and despair. Forensic teams spent 3 days processing the scene. They found Emma's DNA throughout the room, hair samples, blood from where the shackle had rubbed her ankle raw, fingerprints on the walls. The evidence painted a picture of 5 months in hell, 5 months of captivity in a concrete room with no daylight, no privacy, no hope. The forensic psychologist who consulted on the case estimated that Emma had been chained in that room approximately 23 hours per day, every day, for 5 months. The only time she'd been unchained was when Rigsby brought food or water, and even then the door would have been locked. The medical examiner later found evidence of repeated sexual assault, malnutrition, muscle atrophy from lack of movement, bruising in various stages of healing. Emma had been systematically tortured for months, and she'd been completely helpless to stop it or escape it. Harold Rigsby had lived alone on that farm for over 20 years, ever since his wife died of cancer in the early 2000s. He had no children, no close family, a few distant cousins who hadn't spoken to him in years. He worked his land, raised some cattle, grew corn and soybeans. went into town for supplies every week or two, attended church occasionally, though not regularly, exchanged pleasantries with the cashiers at the feed store and the grocery, lived a quiet, unremarkable life that gave nobody any reason to look at him twice. And beneath his kitchen, in a concrete room, he kept Emma Caldwell chained like an animal. The investigation turned to the question that haunted everyone involved. Why had Rigsby taken Emma out of that basement after keeping her hidden for 5 months? Why risk driving through a checkpoint where any officer might decide to take a closer look? Why expose himself after going to such elaborate lengths to keep her captive? Investigators found the answer in the truck's glove compartment. Medical paperwork dated that same morning, March 14, 2025. Harold Rigsby had been to the county hospital early that day for test results. The diagnosis was written in clinical language, but the meaning was clear. Terminal pancreatic cancer, advanced stage, metastasized to his liver and lungs. The oncologist's notes estimated 6-month survival time, maybe less, probably less. Rigsby was dying, and he knew it. That explained everything. Rigsby couldn't leave Emma locked in his basement after he died. She'd starved to death down there, and eventually someone would come to deal with his property and find her body. The secret would come out. His reputation, whatever mattered to him about how people remembered him, would be destroyed. He'd be remembered as a monster, a kidnapper, a rapist. Even dead, he couldn't accept that. So he'd made a decision. For the first time in 5 months, he'd gone down to that basement and unchained Emma, brought her upstairs into daylight that must have blinded her after so long in the dark, put her in his truck. Maybe he told her they were going somewhere. Maybe he told her he was letting her go. Maybe he said nothing at all. Investigators would never know his exact plan. The prevailing theory was that he intended to drive her somewhere remote, kill her, and bury her body where it would never be found. Then he'd go home, get his affairs in order as much as possible, and wait to die. The cancer would kill him. Emma would simply disappear forever, never connected to him. He'd die with his secret. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd driven through that checkpoint. And Officer Michael Torres had looked at Emma Caldwell and seen exactly what she was, a victim silently screaming for help. Torres had seen it in her eyes, in the way she sat, in the flat, emotionless way she said, "I'm fine," while everything about her body language said the opposite. Torres had pressed, had insisted on talking to her directly, had ordered Rigsby out of the vehicle, and Rigsby had realized in that moment that his plan was falling apart. Torres was going to separate them. Torres was going to ask more questions. Emma might break down, might tell everything. 20 years of prison for kidnapping and rape, dying in a cell instead of in his own home. So Rigsby had reached under his seat where he'd placed a loaded pistol before leaving his property that morning. He'd always meant to use it, just not like this. Not at a checkpoint with witnesses. But circumstances had forced his hand. He'd shot Emma first. 1 shot to the head. She died instantly, probably without even understanding what was happening. Then he'd turned the gun on Torres, firing twice. Then, with Torres on the ground and backup units surely already on the way, Rigsby had pressed the barrel under his own chin and pulled the trigger one final time. 3 shots, maybe 10 seconds total. 2 people dead, 1 officer wounded, and a secret that had been buried for 5 months suddenly exposed in the worst possible way. The community struggled to process what had happened. Harold Rigsby had been part of the landscape for 40 years. People knew his name. They'd seen him around town for decades. He was just the old farmer from out on County Road 47. Quiet, maybe a bit odd, the way solitary people often seem odd to those who live differently. But nobody had suspected anything like this. Nobody had imagined that behind his ordinary exterior lived a monster who'd kidnapped a young woman and held her prisoner for months. How could you live next to evil and not know it? How could you exchange small talk with someone at the feed store, not knowing that he was going home to a basement where a teenager was chained to the floor? That question haunted everyone who'd ever interacted with Rigsby, however briefly. The cashier who'd rung up his groceries every week, the pastor who'd seen him in church occasionally, the farmers who'd waved to him as they drove past his property. Had there been signs? Had they missed something? Or was evil really that good at hiding in plain sight? Emma's family was shattered. Her mother, Rebecca, and her father, Thomas, had been living in a nightmare for 5 months, not knowing if their daughter was alive or dead, hoping against hope that somehow she'd come home. Learning that she'd been so close the entire time, suffering unimaginable torment while they searched everywhere else, was unbearable. Learning that she'd died violently at a checkpoint, killed by her captor rather than rescued, added another layer of horror to grief that already felt unsurvivable. But they'd had no idea that the worst revelation was still coming. Officer Michael Torres spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from his gunshot wounds. 1 bullet had caught him in the shoulder, shattering his collarbone. Another had grazed his ribs, leaving a furrow in his side that burned like fire every time he breathed. He was lucky. The doctors told him that repeatedly. A few inches different on either shot, and he'd have been dead before backup arrived. In interviews after his release, Torres talked about that moment at the checkpoint. Everyone wanted to know how he'd known something was wrong. What had he seen that made him press further when Rigsby wanted to just drive away? The way she sat there, Torres said in one interview, his voice still rough from the breathing tube they'd had to use during surgery. The way she looked at me when I asked if she was okay. She said yes, but everything else about her was saying no. Her eyes were saying no. Her whole body was saying no. She was trapped and terrified, and she couldn't say it out loud, but she was screaming it with everything else she had. I couldn't let that truck drive away. I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. His decision to press further had been exactly right, but it had come too late to save Emma. The entire confrontation from when Rigsby reached for the gun to when he shot himself had lasted less than 30 seconds. Emma had died instantly from the gunshot. She'd probably never even known that Torres was trying to help her. She'd probably thought she was being driven somewhere to die, and when the truck stopped at a checkpoint, maybe she'd felt a flicker of hope. But before that hope could become anything real, Rigsby had ended it. The case seemed closed. Tragic, horrific, but closed. A predator who'd kidnapped a young woman and held her captive for months had killed her rather than face justice, then killed himself. The investigation would continue, documenting everything, building a complete picture of what had happened. But the criminal case was over. Both perpetrator and victim were dead. The only thing left was for Emma's family to try to find some way to live with what had happened and somehow move forward. Then, 3 weeks after Emma's funeral, Rebecca Caldwell came forward with information that reopened everything in the worst possible way. Rebecca had been carrying a secret for 19 years, a secret she'd kept from her husband, from her daughter, from everyone in her life, a secret that had seemed like the right decision at the time, the safe decision, the decision that protected everyone involved. But secrets have weight. They press down on you, day after day, year after year, until you're not sure anymore if you're protecting people or just protecting yourself from the consequences of your own choices. After Emma's death, after learning the horrific details of what Rigsby had done to her, Rebecca had been consumed by a question that gave her no peace. Did he know? Did Harold Rigsby know Emma was his biological daughter when he kidnapped her that October afternoon? Did he know while he kept her chained in his basement for 5 months? Did he know what DNA connected them when he put that gun to her head and pulled the trigger? Rebecca came to the police with her secret on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after Emma's funeral. She sat in an interview room with 2 detectives and spoke words that she'd never spoken aloud to anyone. 19 years earlier, Rebecca had been living with her parents on their farm. She'd been 22 years old, engaged to Thomas Caldwell, planning a wedding for the following spring. Her life was mapped out. Simple, safe, predictable. She'd marry Thomas, they'd move to the city for his job, they'd start a family. Everything was planned. Harold Rigsby was 42 at the time. He'd helped Rebecca's father with farm work occasionally when his own workload was heavy. Haying season, harvest time, fence repairs after storms. Rigsby was just Harold, the quiet guy from the next property over. Rebecca had known him her whole life the way you know anyone in a small rural community. He was part of the landscape, like the grain elevator or the county fair or Sunday services at the Methodist church. Something had happened between them that summer. Rebecca never explained the details to the detectives, and maybe the details didn't matter. A moment of weakness, a mistake, a brief affair that lasted maybe 2 months before Rebecca came to her senses and ended it. She'd felt guilty and ashamed. She'd convinced herself it had been a temporary insanity, a last gasp of freedom before settling into married life. She'd buried it deep and never looked back. She'd married Thomas in October as planned. The wedding was perfect. Small ceremony at the farm, reception in her parents' barn, all their friends and family celebrating. Harold Rigsby hadn't been invited. There was no reason to invite him. He was just a neighbor who occasionally helped with farm work. 1 month after the wedding, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant. The timing was close enough that she convinced herself the baby was Thomas's. Or maybe she just chose to believe it because the alternative was too complicated, too destructive to everything she'd built. She was married now. She loved Thomas. They were starting a family together. The past was the past. Emma was born the following June. Thomas believed she was his daughter. He'd been there for every ultrasound, every doctor's appointment, the entire labor and delivery. He'd cut the umbilical cord. He'd held Emma first. She was his daughter in every way that mattered. Rebecca watched Thomas bond with Emma and felt her secret settle deeper into permanent silence. This was her family. This was what mattered. The DNA didn't change anything. Emma grew up loved by both parents. When she was 5, Rebecca and Thomas moved to the city for Thomas's job. Better opportunities, better schools, a chance to give Emma more than rural Nebraska could offer, but they visited the family farm regularly. Emma spent summers with her grandparents, helping with chores, learning to love farm life just like Rebecca had as a child. Harold Rigsby remained a neighbor. Emma saw him occasionally over the years, the quiet farmer from the adjacent property. He'd say hello if they crossed paths. Sometimes he'd be at the farm store when Emma and her grandfather were buying supplies. There was never anything unusual about these encounters. Rigsby was just background scenery in Emma's life. She had no idea there was any connection between them beyond geography. Rebecca never told anyone the truth. As the years passed, it became easier to believe her own lie. Emma was Thomas's daughter. Biology didn't matter. Love mattered. Family mattered. The secret was just something that had happened 19 years ago that had no relevance to their lives anymore. Then Emma was kidnapped. Then Emma was held captive and tortured for 5 months. Then Emma was killed. And suddenly, Rebecca's secret felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds pressing down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. The detectives listened to Rebecca's confession in silence. When she finished, one of them asked the question that mattered most. Did Harold Rigsby know Emma was his biological daughter? Rebecca shook her head. I never told him about the pregnancy. I never told him Emma might be his. I never told anyone. There was no reason for him to suspect anything, which meant Harold Rigsby had kidnapped, imprisoned, repeatedly assaulted, and ultimately murdered his own daughter without knowing it. The detectives ordered DNA testing to verify Rebecca's claim. They exhumed a small tissue sample from Rigsby's body, still in the county morgue awaiting final disposition. They compared it to Emma's DNA on file from her autopsy. The lab results came back 2 weeks later, definitive and damning. Harold Rigsby was Emma Caldwell's biological father. The probability was 99.99%. There was no doubt. The court sealed the records to protect the family's privacy, but the truth was out there now. The investigation had to grapple with a new horrifying dimension to an already horrifying case. But it didn't change the fundamental facts. Rigsby was dead. Emma was dead. There would be no trial, no testimony, no chance to ask Rigsby what he'd known or not known. His motivations died with him. Investigators and forensic psychologists studied everything they could find about Rigsby. His journals, his computer, his financial records, his property. They were looking for any indication that he'd known about Emma's paternity. They found nothing. His journals mentioned Emma's kidnapping in clinical detached terms, but there was no suggestion of biological connection. He wrote about her as a possession, an object, not as someone he had any particular emotional connection to. The prevailing theory among experts who studied the case was that Rigsby genuinely didn't know. Rebecca had never told him. There was no reason for him to suspect. Emma didn't look particularly like him. She favored Rebecca's side of the family. Rigsby had targeted Emma because she was young, vulnerable, accessible. She was his neighbor's granddaughter, someone he'd seen around occasionally, someone who trusted him enough to go with him to check a fence line. But the question remained, if Rigsby had known Emma was his daughter, would it have stopped him? Or would it have made his actions even more depraved? The psychologists couldn't agree. Some argued that a man capable of what Rigsby did wouldn't have been stopped by biological connection. Psychopathy doesn't recognize family bonds. Others suggested that knowing might have protected Emma, that Rigsby might have targeted her specifically because he didn't know, because she was just another potential victim to him. The truth died with Harold Rigsby and would never be known. Thomas Caldwell, the man who'd raised Emma from birth, was devastated by the revelation. The detective had called him separately to inform him before the DNA results became part of the official record. Thomas listened in silence, then said, "That doesn't change anything about how I feel about her. She was my daughter. I raised her. I loved her. Biology doesn't matter." But of course it did matter. Not because Thomas loved Emma any less, that was impossible, but because of what it meant. The monster who'd killed his daughter, who'd tortured her for months, who'd stolen her life, had been her biological father. It added a layer of cosmic cruelty to a tragedy that was already unbearable. Rebecca's marriage to Thomas didn't survive. The secret, combined with the trauma of losing Emma, created damage that couldn't be repaired. Thomas couldn't look at Rebecca without thinking about what her silence had cost. Would Emma still be alive if Rebecca had told the truth 19 years ago? Would Rigsby have formed some kind of connection with Emma that protected her? Or would he have done exactly what he did, making the tragedy even more twisted? There were no answers. Only anger and grief and guilt swirling together into something toxic that poisoned everything it touched. Rebecca couldn't look at Thomas without seeing accusation in his eyes, even though he never said it out loud. She couldn't look at herself in the mirror without seeing a coward who'd kept a secret to protect her comfortable life and had somehow, impossibly, contributed to her daughter's death. The logical part of her brain knew that her secret hadn't caused what Rigsby did. He was a monster who would have done monstrous things regardless, but grief and guilt aren't logical. They don't care about reason. Thomas and Rebecca divorced 18 months after Emma's funeral. It was quiet, uncontested, unbearably sad. They both knew their marriage had died the same day Emma did. They were just making it official. Officer Michael Torres received a commendation from the Nebraska State Patrol for his actions at that checkpoint. His instinct that something was wrong had been absolutely correct, even though the outcome was tragic. The chief presented the commendation at a ceremony Torres didn't want to attend, but felt obligated to. Torres stood in his dress uniform, shoulder still aching from where the bullet had shattered his collarbone, and accepted an award for failing to save someone's life. In an interview 1 year after the shooting, Torres talked about the case with a journalist. "I think about it all the time," he said. "What if I'd handled it differently? What if I'd been more aggressive sooner? What if I'd been less aggressive and he didn't feel cornered? But I also know that girl was asking for help without saying a word. Her whole body was screaming it. I couldn't ignore that. I had to try." The body cam footage from that checkpoint exists in an evidence locker somewhere. It's never been released publicly. Law enforcement agencies use it as training material, teaching officers how to recognize signs of coercion and duress in traffic stops. What happened in those final seconds has been reconstructed through Torres's testimony and forensic analysis of the scene. Rigsby reaching for the gun under his seat. The first shot hitting Emma in the temple, killing her instantly. 2 shots fired at Torres, one shattering his shoulder, one grazing his ribs. The final shot as Rigsby pressed the gun under his own chin and pulled the trigger. 3 people at a checkpoint, 2 dead within 30 seconds, 1 left to live with the memories and the questions that would never have answers. Harold Rigsby's property was sold by his estate. No relatives came forward to claim it. The few distant cousins, he had wanted nothing to do with any of it. A development company bought the land, demolished everything, the house, the barn, the basement where Emma had been held. They scraped it all away and filled in the basement with dirt and gravel. The land sits empty now, too marked by horror for anyone to want to build there. Local kids tell stories about it being haunted. Maybe it is, in a way. Not by ghosts, but by the weight of what happened there. Emma's grandparents never recovered from losing her. Her grandfather died of a heart attack less than a year after Emma's death. The doctors said it was natural causes. His heart just gave out. But everyone knew what really killed him. You can die of grief. Your heart can literally break under the weight of loss. His wife, Emma's grandmother, moved away after his funeral. She sold the farm where Emma had spent so many happy summers and moved to Colorado to live with her sister. She couldn't stay in a place where every field, every fence line, every familiar landmark reminded her of the granddaughter she'd lost. Rebecca Caldwell lives quietly now, somewhere far from Nebraska. She changed her name legally, started over in a place where nobody knows her story. In one interview before she disappeared from public view, she said something that haunts everyone who heard it. "I made a choice 19 years ago to keep a secret. I thought I was protecting my family. I thought I was making things simpler, making my life work better. Instead, that secret became part of a nightmare I couldn't have imagined in my worst moments. I don't know if telling the truth back then would have changed anything. Maybe Emma would still be dead. Maybe Harold would have done what he did anyway. But I'll spend the rest of my life wondering." Thomas Caldwell still lives in Nebraska, though not in the same city where he and Rebecca raised Emma. He moved after the divorce, needed a fresh start somewhere without so many memories. He speaks at a memorial held every year on March 14th, the anniversary of Emma's death. Different people organize it each year, different locations around the state, but Thomas always attends. He talks about the daughter he raised and loved, refusing to let the circumstances of her death or the revelation about her paternity define her memory. "Emma was my daughter," he says every year. The words identical because the truth they contain never changes. Biology doesn't change that. What happened to her was evil. What we learned afterward was tragic. But Emma was my daughter in every way that mattered, and that's what I choose to remember. I remember her laugh. I remember teaching her to ride a bike. I remember her high school graduation. I remember the person she was, not how she died, or who her biological father turned out to be. That's what I hold on to. That's all I have left. Harold Rigsby is buried in a small cemetery outside the town where he lived his entire life. His grave has no marker. His name appears in the cemetery records, plot number and date of burial, but there's no headstone, no monument, nothing to indicate who lies there. no one visits. The grass grows over the grave, same as every other grave, but this one carries no flowers, no mementos, no signs that anyone remembers or mourns. Rebecca Caldwell has never visited Emma's grave. She said in interviews that she doesn't feel like she deserves to stand there, doesn't deserve to mourn in the same place as the people who loved Emma without secrets and lies between them. The guilt is too overwhelming. She lives with the knowledge that her secret, kept to protect herself and her comfortable life, became entangled in her daughter's death in the most horrible way imaginable. Logic says her secret didn't cause what Rigsby did. But guilt doesn't care about logic. Emma Caldwell would be 19 years old now if she'd lived. Her friends from high school have graduated college, started careers, moved into their adult lives. They post on social media about jobs and relationships and ordinary young adult concerns. Emma's life ended at 18 in a truck on a highway, killed by a monster who happened to be her biological father, surrounded by secrets and lies that she never knew existed. The lessons from this case are uncomfortable and complicated. Trust your instincts when something seems wrong. Secrets kept to protect ourselves often end up hurting the people we love most in ways we could never predict. Evil can live right next door, hiding behind a familiar face, and we might never see it until it's too late. Sometimes there are no good answers. Sometimes a tragedy is just a tragedy. Layers of horrible coincidence and terrible choices stacking on top of each other until the weight of it crushes everyone involved. Sometimes all we can do is bear witness, remember the victims, try to learn whatever lessons can be learned, and keep going. Officer Torres said something in that interview a year later that people remember. You can't save everyone, but you have to try. If I'd done nothing, let that truck drive away, I'd have to live with that too. At least this way. I know I tried. At least Emma's family got answers. Even if the answers were horrible. That's all we can do sometimes. Try, and then live with the outcome, whatever it is. Emma Caldwell was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with dreams and plans and a whole life ahead of her. She loved animals and farm life and summer nights and simple things. She deserved to live that life. She deserved to grow up and go to college and fall in love and have children of her own and grow old. Instead, she got 5 months in hell and a bullet at a checkpoint. Remember her name. Remember her face. Remember that she mattered. Remember that evil is real, and it hides in plain sight, and sometimes we only see it when it's already too late. Rest in peace, Emma Caldwell. You deserved so much better than what this world gave you. The end.